Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real honour and a real pleasure to be here today. I'm a huge admirer of MSF in terms of its commitment and its integrity, so thank you very much for the opportunity. We have very little time, so I'm just going to jump really straight into it at breakneck speed and try and get through a presentation that could really be enough substance for a week-long conference. So in general, the outline of the presentation, I'm going to try and put things a little bit in perspective and give a little bit of context in terms of the role of communication in humanitarian action. We'll talk a little bit about the potential and the limits of digital technologies, mobile technologies, which will be the big focus of this session. It's not all dazzle, it's not all wondrous technologies. There's a lot of limitations and there's a lot of reality checks that we need to consider. An important consideration as well, I think, is the organisational models of aid agencies and aid organisations. Can aid agencies adapt quickly enough, strategically enough to integrate the undoubted benefits of new technologies? And then, in a little bit of a dream sequence at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what the future holds. So first of all, I'd just like to talk about the fact that communication in a humanitarian setting, it's nothing new. It has always been prized as a very valuable commodity and strategic part of humanitarian operations. Communicating about your neutrality, your independence, your impartiality, the very essence of the humanitarian action itself was always a very important foundation in terms of building acceptance for humanitarian organisations working in the international context. Information as a commodity is neither something new. This is a photograph from Somalia from the early 2000s when wind-up radios were distributed to the population inside Somalia in order that they could be connected with the diaspora outside through collaboration with the BBC World Service, something that was extremely effective and still goes on today. Maybe one of the most poignant examples of the power of information as a humanitarian commodity is the traditional Red Cross message. It's been around since 1879. And it's maybe even a precursor to Twitter. You're only allowed 25 words, except you have to keep it personal. But what it's about is about reuniting families, the contact between families who have been divided by conflict or detention or internal strife. This is a photograph from Colombia, a lady reading a letter from her brother who was detained in prison for 9 years, but whom the family had assumed to be dead and missing. In 2005, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent issued what is today a sort of a Bible for people interested in the whole area of information in a humanitarian setting. In their World Disasters Report of 2005, which focused on information as aid. This is a well-known quote from that, and I'd like to focus on the end of it because I'll be coming back to this, and this is really, for me, the most compelling issue when we talk about new technologies in a humanitarian setting is the recognition that information bestows power, but to whom and for whom is the question that we need to keep at the back of our minds. Talking a little bit about digital opportunities, cellular technology was used extensively in the response to the tsunami in 2004. This would have been really the start of it in humanitarian terms. It was quickly recognised by many of the agencies on the ground that a lot of the population affected in the Indian Ocean region were indeed contactable through mobile phones and were using their mobile phones to seek information. This affected the way organisations ran, and I think it's also important to recognise that the success of integrating mobile technology in the response to that operation was largely due to the collaboration with traditional and mainstream media, particularly local radio. So it wasn't about one technology surpassing another, it was rather about it fitting into the ecosystem of already time-proven communication mediums. In 2010, in Haiti, quite often referred to now as the first digital disaster. It's been well documented, and there are many important lessons learned that have come out of Haiti, which I'm sure will be integrated into future large-scale humanitarian response and disasters response. A very important part of that, again, and it's going to form a common theme of this talk, is that what was really important about the technological use in the humanitarian response in Haiti, it wasn't necessarily the gadgets themselves or the technology itself. It was the fact that it truly enabled the humanitarian organisations present to really mobilise the local community, to engage the local community, to empower the local community, to turn people from victims into first responders, in essence to make them part of the team. And I think that is really where the true humanitarian benefits will come from the use of new technology. Talking about the tsunami response in 2004, in April 2011 there was an 8.7 earthquake in the Indian Ocean region again, which of course caused a tremendous sense of foreboding. Fortunately, the tsunami itself didn't materialize as predicted, but the communities responded in a way that was almost unpredictable. The community mobilization was extraordinary right throughout the region because of a lot of the preparation that had been done as a response to the tsunami, of course, but there was a number of new factors in the equation. One was definitely the proliferation of mobile phones in the region and the recognition of the importance of SMS technology in particular, which allowed contact with communities at risk. Second, we had a lot of new and interesting technologies like oceanographic radars that were transmitting signals to satellites that were being beamed down to meteorological stations in the coastal areas at risk. Very importantly, and often forgotten, and I think very relevant for a lot of the presentations we heard earlier today, there was a number of organisations, not many, people I'm thinking like the International Research Institute for Climate and Society in Columbia University and the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Centre in The Hague. And these people were dedicating themselves to getting the technical data that was available for experts and ensuring that it could be converted and transmitted in an understandable, comprehensible, credible way to the communities who needed it most. And this is an extremely important part of the equation which is often forgotten. So actionable data was now becoming a reality in the Asia-Pacific region, which allowed people to mobilise. So at the end of the day, it was this guy on a bicycle with a megaphone who's much more important than the technology. For all of the technology you have in the world, it is no good if this guy who has a credibility and a standing in his own community and a knowledge about disaster preparedness, if he cannot act on actionable data, then we've somehow missed the plot. So it is a story about people, it is a story about communities, it's about empowering communities. Now, another opportunity in which we've heard a little bit about earlier, and I think we'll hear about later on as well, is the whole area of crisis mapping. Crisis mapping for me it's a fantastic development. I think it has huge potential, but it is very much in its infancy, and we also need to be aware that there are also risks to using crisis mapping. It allows us definitely to filter the noise from the flow of data and to engage and involve people much more. Importantly, they must have access to a whole range of technologies in order to do that. If we think the most recent example, and I think it's a very important example and maybe even a milestone when we look at it retrospectively in the future sometime, the Libya crisis map, which was set up by OCHA and a group of technology volunteers called the Standby Technology Task Force, was set up for the Libya crisis in 2011. Now, one of the risks was immediately identified by a well-known American magazine called Fast Company. This is it's a real risk. If you're putting information out there, open sourced, it can be picked up by anyone, and anyone can also be the military intelligence of parties to the conflict. So this is a real risk. Nevertheless, I think the value that can be taken from this sort of crisis mapping is far outweighs the risks, and we need to work on the risks, and we need to ensure that people's privacy and security is guaranteed, but not forsaking the huge potential that these maps have. So this crisis map was set up, and I think there's an important backstory here, was set up by a guy called Andre Marti. This is his Twitter handle at the end. Sorry, Andre Verity. Andre Marti is a Swiss journalist. Andre Verity, he's an information management officer with OCHA, and he undertook to work with this volunteer group of technology volunteers dotted all around the globe. To put things a little bit in perspective, in Haiti, that was the first time this type of people, just volunteers, coders, software people, technologists, there was 16,000 of them active in Haiti, scouring the net for data and mapping it. It was a bit more organised in this sense, in that it was a deliberate decision was taken. It wasn't as organic as in Haiti, and I think there was about 150 technologists involved. In 48 hours, they managed to do what had taken 4 weeks in Haiti in terms of just mapping who's doing what where. There was a lot of challenges. There was the achievements, one could argue, were relatively modest. And I know in the humanitarian world, it's quite a donor-driven world at times. We're very obsessed with what's the impact. It's a very important question. It's a chestnut of a question. It's an extremely important question, but it can also be a little bit limiting, because not everything fits neatly into a matrix paradigm. And if I believe it's very, very important to measure impact. Nevertheless, we also need to risk, be prepared to fail, if we're going to create and innovate. It's what's happening with successful industry in the private technology sectors, and I think we need to learn from that. And I would see Andre Verity as a type of innovator and disruptor in his own organisation, because the impact, when we look at it, actually had nothing really directly to do with what it set out to do. The unintended consequences turned out to be more important. So if it had been prevented because of the lack of ability to measure impact, they would never have arrived in that place. And unintended consequences basically challenged the way OCHA worked. And I think this is really important, because I think organisations will have to rethink the way they're working if they're to truly harness the power and benefits of technology going forward. The way that decisions are taken today, the structures of organisations, do not necessarily accommodate the flexibility and the innovation that's needed to keep up with what's happening on the ground. And it is the people on the ground and the technology that they're using that are shaping the aid effort, and not necessarily the organisations in the former paradigm. Mobile technology as well is being used in lots of different ways. And I came across this story on the Federation website, and I really liked it, because there was some great quotes from the guy who's running this project in East Africa to try and use mobile technology to fight hunger. Now, this is mostly taking place out of Kenya, where, for instance, mobile money is an enormous part of what's happening. I mean, there was more mobile money moved through Kenya last year than the entire amount of money that Western Union moved around the world. It's just an incredible, huge success. So they're trying to tap in to what's happening on the ground. They're trying to fit into what's happening on the ground. And I really liked, if you allow me just to read out a couple of quotes from a guy called Steve McDowell, who talked about, if I can find him here, I beg your pardon, he talked about mobile phones are everywhere in East Africa, even in many remote areas. If mobile companies could improve access further, then people's lives can change. A mobile phone gives you access to information. You can find out that your goat is worth more money than the middleman is offering, meaning you have better access to food, medical care and education. Mobile money means your phone becomes a bank, and there are lots of applications, like paying salaries. If you can pay employees through your phone, then it's much safer and more accountable. Humanitarian organisations, and this is the part I like, humanitarian organisations need to keep abreast of changes in technology and how communities are using it themselves. We need to be willing to experiment with new ways of using technology and learn from the experiments that will sometimes fail. Now that, I think, is a very big statement. I've never really heard that in any of the meetings that I've been in over the last 15 years in humanitarian operations, that we're willing to risk and willing to fail, because we know that it's very, very important to learn from what's happening in the environment around me. Mobile technology is key to helping the younger generation of East Africans prepare for future droughts, floods and other factors that leave people without access to food, says McDowell. So many people have cell phones, they're going to be one of the stock tools of our trade in the near future. We keep trying, and it's just a matter of time before we get it right. So willing to keep trying, willing to keep learning from it. This is the internet generation in East Africa, so we'll have to speak with them differently than we spoke to their parents. So mobile phones have been recognised on the ground in environments like this as a stock tool of the trade. Not necessarily because organisations have decided that this is a really important way to go because it makes our lives easier, but importantly it's been driven from the ground. And I think that's really, really important when we think about the lessons learned or the directions we need to go in. The direction we need to go in is what's happening on the ground. So we need people in organisations who can understand what's happening in the ground and who can document that, and even collaborate with private sector who have really got the best information about how people are using technology. So the mobile miracle of the 20th century, for the last 20 years, has been something quite phenomenal. We have 6 billion mobile subscriptions on the planet today. Until yesterday, I was at a conference in Turkey, and until yesterday I thought, well, the number of subscriptions will be limited by the number of gadgets. In a way I was right, but what I had not foreseen was machine-to-machine communication. So I was at this conference where they were talking about machine-to-machine communication, and they reckon in the next 5 years to 10 years maximum, you could have an extra 44 billion subscriptions, cellular subscriptions, digital machines connected together, which is going to produce an enormous amount of data. So, and I'll come to the data in a moment. So when we're talking about new opportunities and new digital opportunities, there's one aspect that I've been learning a lot about and realizing a lot about in recent months, and that's the power of broadband. Broadband is something that maybe for most of us here is something that gives us higher speed access to the internet and allows us to watch YouTube on our iPads. For the majority of people in the world, broadband is a set of transformative technologies. It's allowing them to participate in society in a way that they could never have dreamed of before. It's fundamentally changing the way people live all over the world, the way they access education, the way they participate in health services, the way they receive and participate in government services. And it is something that is recognized very much in the developing world. In Nigeria, I can tell you, for instance, that they're already rolling out on 4G. I don't know if there's any country in Europe that has successfly done that. And this is a country with 120 million people, 100 million of them with mobile phones. And I think that this is really important, because the more people are connected, the more they will be empowered, the more they will be able to work together to create economies, etc. I was in Kigali a couple of weeks ago, and I was meeting a lot of young entrepreneurs there. Interestingly enough, they were mostly women, which is something I don't see on this side of the world either. And they were working primarily on, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but they were working on very socially oriented projects. They were working on the creation of local content. They were working at empowering citizens by getting information from government through SMS technology into the hands of people. And they were working on connecting disparate technology entrepreneurs together to create bigger projects. These weren't NGOs, these were businesses. They're business oriented, and they're completely self-sustaining, and they're very, very focused. And it was not a coincidence that the broadband connection in Kigali is 4 times faster than what I get in Geneva. So broadband is really something to think about, and to think about in terms as well about the importance of people having access to this type of technology, which is really possible now. It's not a matter of expense or infrastructure. With mobile broadband, it's totally, totally possible, and to think about how it can empower communities. Something I've been quite obsessed about in recent times is Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and just to look at the part in blue: to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. This is something I think needs to be considered in the digital world. What exactly does it mean in terms of people's ability to receive and impart information through any media? This is a human rights issue potentially. It could potentially logically lead us to a place where MSF is running a campaign for people's right to communicate, and people's right to broadband, and people's right to access critical communication structure. I'm sorry if I've abused the MSF logo there with the mobile phone. It was all in the interests of stimulating campaign. I'm not a very good graphic designer either, as you'll see. So to move along, what else does the future hold, or what about the future? Well, big data is something we all need to be aware of. Sorry, it's gone off my screen here. Big data is something we all need to be aware of. Just to put it in context, big data is basically the digital traces that are left behind today and what we can learn from them. In 2011, there was more data generated worldwide than there was in the history of man and womankind before that. There is just a tremendous explosion of data, and we can learn an awful lot from it. In order to do this, we need to, again, think more strategically about how technology is used in our organizations. We need to collaborate with private sector who have real access to all of this information. And we can think of multiple uses. And in order just to give you a quick look well, actually, maybe we'll skip the video because I know we're short on time. I had a video of it's called Ville Vivante, Living City. You can find it online, and it's tracing the mobile phone activity in Geneva over a 24-hour period, and it's fascinating the way you can see the movements of people, when, where, and how. And if we were to apply that to a humanitarian setting, I'm sure it would be really compelling. If we could move to the next slide, please. So now I just wanted to talk about another thing about the future that I think is overlooked quite a lot. And for me, if I was to pick one thing that is really going to change the future, in terms of, I'm thinking specifically in terms of humanitarian world, but not just, of course, it will be applicable to many different sectors. For me, connectivity it's all about content, and this is something I think we really need to think about. The Yoruba people from Nigeria, just to put up a couple of figures here, is 21% of the population of Nigeria, up to 50 million people in West Africa. There are 29,000 articles in the Yoruba language on Wikipedia compared to 14,000 last year. So connectivity creates local content, which leads to empowerment. I think that this is the real story of connectivity and new technologies in the developing world and in Africa. Yes, people are using SMS for public health. Yes, they're using it for malaria, etc., etc. But the real story is that they're using it to tell stories, to share knowledge, and to build their own narrative of their own worlds. And I think this will create an interesting paradigm where really people are leading and innovating in terms of their own humanitarian situations. So final slide, what the future holds. Again, I cherry-picked a number of things. We could, as I said, run a whole conference on this, but I think any organisation that is still looking at technology as patching computers together and making sure mobile phones are working and everything like this, you're sort of missing the point. It's absolutely needs to be a strategic part of the operation, particularly in terms of understanding what people are doing. Not what are the latest gadgets we need, but how are people using technology in the communities and countries where we're working. So the future will hold far more community-driven development, because people will be better connected, easier to mobilise amongst themselves, less dependent, more knowledgeable, easier to act earlier than before because they'll have the information at hand. I would hope to see some risk-taking in aid organisations where we can maybe develop something which I've called Innovate, where people like Andre Verity and Steve McDowell are given the space to make mistakes and to innovate and collaborate. I think Article 19 will really lead to meaningful digital inclusion if humanitarian organisations see that the possibilities with ensuring people's right to communicate and ensuring their right to access critical communication infrastructure. Data for good will be something definitely that will become very, very important. It's already happening, but we need to be able to manage enormous amount of data, which will be increasing 60 and 70-fold per year over the next years. And it will allow us, and this will be something a reality in the very near future, I'm sure, real-time analysis once we can harness it. The future is mobile, the future is broadband, and content is king, and long live the king. Thank you very much.